Hello and welcome to Politics London. Coming up now with further revelations of misogyny at the Met. Is it time for the Commissioner, Cressida Dick, to consider her position?
I've been quite clear to the Met Police Commissioner that she needs to come up with an effective plan urgently on how she addresses the clear examples of racist, sexist, misogynistic, discriminatory practices.
And as the government threatens Russia with sanctions over the Ukraine crisis, is the UK turning a blind eye to Russian money laundering in the capital?
We should be really proud of London and really ashamed of Londongrad, because this is where the worst people in the world come to launder their fortunes and their reputations.
Good morning. Great to have you with us for the programme. Hello and welcome. I'm Samantha Simmons. I'm joined for the duration of the show by Stella Creasy, Labour MP for Walthamstow, and by Chris Philp, Conservative MP for Croydon South, who is a Minister in the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. A very warm welcome to you both. And as ever, if you'd like to join in the conversation at home, do follow us at BBC London News. Now, I want to begin with the issue of absent school children. New research by the Centre for Social Justice has found some of the poorer areas of London have been massively impacted. Boroughs including Newham, Enfield and Croydon have almost 3,000 so-called ghost children between them. That's a term used for children with a less than 50% attendance rate. Jessica Ewer has this.
This mum doesn't want to be named. Her son has always struggled with going to school, and at its worst, his attendance was just 10%.
It became an anxiety of even mentioning the word school to him on the way. He felt really sick, and he was even gagging in the car, and I'd get outside and he'd be shaking. The anxiety got to the point where he was picking at his fingers, at the side of his fingers, and he would go down a few layers and his hands look awful. Sad that he was practically self-harming himself because he just had the anxiety that he didn't want to go.
New research exclusive to Politics London shows the capital has almost 14,000 ghost children. That means they've been off school more than they've been in, and it's only been made worse by lockdowns. The worst affected boroughs are some of the poorest in the capital, including Newham, Enfield and Croydon. Practitioners like this one from charity School Home Support work with ghost children in the worst affected areas. They offer one-to-one support to children like the son of the mum that we spoke to.
They come to us if their attendance is really bad in school. It has to be below 50% for them to get referred to us. A lot of these students suffer with their mental health. That could be anxiety, self-harming, depression. We also offer a lot of funding and it makes a massive difference. Like one student, mum was struggling to get him into school and pick him up because mum worked hard and had other children. So we got him a bike and his attendance just grew massively.
The charities say children across the capital could benefit from this kind of support to help keep the number of absentees down.
Well, I'm joined by the author of that report, Alice Wilcock, Head of Education at the Centre for Social Justice. Alice, welcome to you. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
So tell us about these figures. 14,000 so-called ghost children here in London. That figure's up 68% since pre-COVID. What's going on?
Well, what we're seeing is that severe absence, which is when children are absent more often than they're present, has been growing for some time now. Even before the pandemic, it was increasing by about 10% year on year, but what we're seeing now is that it's skyrocketed after the pandemic. It's obviously difficult to generalise as to what's happened to absence, but we're seeing that there's been a greater increase in anxiety, and that's having a relationship in terms of whether children turn up to school.
The report says that in some schools, entire classes have gone missing. Is that right?
Yeah, so across the country, nearly 800 schools have an entire class worth of children missing, and in London, that's 74 schools. And that's a massive increase from previous years. What we're concerned about is this isn't just one or two children who are missing from school, it's an entire class.
Can you explain why this is impacting so badly on poorer kids?
Yeah, absolutely. So the report finds that schools in the most disadvantaged areas are 10 times more likely to have an entire class worth of children missing, and children actually on free school meals are 3.5 times more likely to be severely absent. I think this has a relationship to do with the reasons why children are absent from school. So we've been speaking to charities and they've said that financial pressures back at home are one of the biggest barriers to attendance. And this has made it even more likely to be a problem in the cost of living crisis. So this is things like children having to make the choice at home, their parents, between paying their bills and putting the heating on or finding a way to get their kids into school. And those kind of stresses trickle into pupils' mental health too.
The Education Secretary has pledged to end what he's called the postcode lottery on school attendance and outcomes. What's he suggesting and what do you make of the proposals?
Yeah, so the Education Secretary has actually been really strong on this and has pledged to tackle persistent absence, which is brilliant. He's recommending consultations and reviews, and he's also launched this kind of alliance to talk about attendance, and there's lots of data gathering that's going on now, and that's vital. But what we're saying is that far too practical steps have been taken to get these children back into the classroom. So they've appointed 5 attendance advisors. We've no idea if any of them will be in London, but all they will do is offer practical support and advice. They won't be boots on the ground. So what we're suggesting is that they take some of the money from the tutoring programme and catch up and divert that into practical measures such as attendance practitioners who work with the families and children to get them back into school and tackle some of those barriers to attendance.
Chris, what do you make of what you've heard and what the government needs to do now?
Well, I'm deeply worried about what I've just heard. Obviously, as a parent and as an MP in Croydon, it's deeply alarming to hear so many London children not regularly attending schools. And by the way, I'm not sure I like the term ghost children because it somehow implies they sort of don't exist properly or that you can see through them. They're real children that we need to be taking, all of us together, much better care of. So, look, I really welcome this report that shines a light on it. And I think the work that the Secretary of State, Nadeem Zahawi, is doing on the research, the Attendance Alliance, to make sure that local authorities and trusts are brought together to discuss this issue, to gather data on it so we better understand it, is really important. But in addition to the advisors that we heard mentioned a second ago, there's also a pilot project now going on with attendance mentors who are the boots on the ground that will actually be there talking to children and families who are affected by this to try and encourage, to coax, to cajole people into coming back to school, which obviously is in their interest. So if that pilot is successful, as I kind of hope it will be, then obviously there's then scope to get that rolled out on a much more widespread scale.
And how quickly will we find out the results of that pilot?
Well, I think the Secretary of State is, the Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, is working on this with a real sense of urgency, as we heard just then. They, for example, got a consultation open on further steps that can be taken, which closes on the 28th of February, just in a few weeks' time. So I do know that the Education Secretary is rightly looking at this with a real sense of urgency.
Stella, these figures are Dickensian, aren't they? Staggering numbers of children missing a huge majority of their education. What's the picture like in Walthamstow?
Well, the picture in Walthamstow is in line with the national trend. And one of the things I think it's quite important to recognise is this is not a new phenomenon. And I'm quite troubled that it's taken this long for government to recognise we need to act. So prior to the pandemic, we were talking about 60,000 children nationally. Now we're talking about 90,000 children nationally who are in this position. I think most of us recognise that school absences are often a symbol of something else happening in a child's life. So it speaks to one of the crises that we face, particularly in social care and the support that's given to families. Often if a child is missing school, that can be quite late along in the concerns that might have led to a child to being in that position in the first place. Certainly within my local community, what I'm terrified about is just the lack of support for families who are finding real pressures, whether it's the cost of housing. I represent a constituency that has the 10th highest level of child poverty in the country, and a lot of that is being driven by housing, which means that for a lot of these children, being in and out of school reflects being in and out of different types of accommodation, but also the pressures on their families, the abilities of their families to be there for them and to support them. I think it's welcome that there is going to be this attention to it. I just query why it's taken so long, especially because the data we're talking about is from last year. So this problem may have got even worse in the intervening months.
Alice, all these children that we're talking about, you know, their parents don't want this. No family, no parent wants their child to miss this amount of their education. What would you say to them, those people who are struggling to get their children into school?
Well, I would say that they desperately need to figure out what's the root cause of attendance problems. You know, I've spoken to loads of parents who say that we try everything. They try to cajole them into school, they try to force them to turn up, but that's not simply the answer. You know, often there's mental health difficulties that are underlying this. You know, we heard on the tape about this child with severe anxiety, and the difficulty is there just isn't enough resources to tackle that level of need. And so I think it's about understanding where that child's coming from, and then seeking the support. And that's why I'm delighted to hear there's going to be attendance mentors rolled out. I think it's crucial that we don't just force children into school. You know, we think education is vital. However, we need to make sure we're tackling the root causes of this problem.
Just briefly, Nadeem Zahawi, the Education Secretary, has said the government won't stand back and let attendance fall. Are you disappointed that they haven't got a handle on this earlier, Stella said?
I mean, yeah, definitely. And I think it's worth pointing out these figures are autumn 2020. So these are the latest figures that we have. We tried to get the figures for summer 2021 and unfortunately they haven't been processed yet. So, yeah, disappointed.
Alice, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us about this report. Now let's just briefly touch on the by-election news that the Conservatives held Southend West, which was not contested by Labour or the Liberal Democrats following the murder of the long-time incumbent MP, Sir David Amess. Chris, your reaction to this result?
Well, I mean, my feeling remains one of just enormous sadness that such a lovely, kind and gentle man as David was just murdered so brutally. That really is the sort of feeling I just continue to have throughout this whole thing. And the by-election has just kind of brought that back to the surface for me personally. Obviously, on a electoral level, Anna won with, I think it was 85% of the vote or something. So delighted that she's been elected. She'll be a really good MP. I think for the area, she'll stand up for Southend in Parliament. But I do just remain just so sad by that such a lovely, kind, gentle man like David has been taken from us.
Yeah, 24% turnout, of course. Stella, Labour didn't contest this by-election out of respect for the late Sir David Amess, but it has been a torrid week for the Prime Minister, hasn't it?
Indeed, but I also think David was such a reminder to us of that kinder, gentler politics, because he was somebody who reached out across the aisle. We all knew him, we all enjoyed his company, and I think we were all extremely shocked and saddened by what happened. And I feel for the MP coming in to follow his great legacy, because I know not just the people of Southend, but obviously in Parliament, David really made a massive impression on all of us and is missed. You don't have to agree with somebody to think that actually they are a decent person. And it is quite frankly a contrast, the politics that David stood up for and the decency in politics he stood up for with some of the rabble-rising and frankly horrific behaviour you've seen in the last week. I don't think anybody would want to defend in politics across any aisle.
Well, Chris, I must just ask you, with the increasing numbers of resignations from Number 10 this week and increasing number of Tory MPs coming out against the Prime Minister, does he still have your support?
He does. I think he's doing what he said he would do earlier in the week by really fundamentally changing the way Number 10 is run, changing the culture, changing the approach, listening more to colleagues in Parliament. He promised on Monday he would do that, and I think the work has now started. There's clearly a lot more to do. And in the meantime, I think people in government are working on dealing with the very difficult issues we face. Like, you know, obviously, we potentially stand on the brink of Russia invading Ukraine or inventing some excuse to invade Ukraine. We've got challenges to meet with the cost of living. And there are so many issues to work on. That's what government.
Chris, thank you. Now, this week, the police watchdog published a damning report which uncovered a culture of bullying, racism, misogyny and sexual harassment among Metropolitan Police officers, predominantly based at Charing Cross Station. The subsequent fallout following a series of recent scandals involving the Met has resulted in the Mayor of London putting the Met Commissioner, Cressida Dick, on notice regarding her position. Helen Price has more and a warning that you may find some of the report distressing.
It's become a familiar headline. A scandal at the Met over the behaviour of officers. The officers investigated by the Independent Office for Police Conduct exchanged messages in which they joked about killing black children, made derogatory comments about gay people and Muslims, and joked about rape. One officer bragged to a co-worker about beating his wife. Another told a female colleague, "I would happily rape you." One constable threatened to murder a female colleague while he was under investigation for sexually harassing her. 9 of the 14 officers investigated by the report are still serving. The police watchdog said the incidents are not simply the behaviour of a few bad apples, but indicate a wider cultural problem at the Met. This is the latest in a series of high-profile scandals at the force, including the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving Met officer. The Mayor of London said he was disgusted by the incidents. The Met apologised for the officer's behaviour, but denied there was a culture of misogyny at the force. For many Londoners, this will further undermine their confidence in the Met's ability to tackle violence against women.
Well, here's what the Mayor had to say on Thursday.
I'm somebody who's not easily angered or disgusted. I am both when it comes to what I've seen over the last couple of days. I've been quite clear to the Met Police Commissioner that she needs to come up with an effective plan urgently on how she addresses the clear examples of racist, sexist, misogynistic, discriminatory practices taking place not by one or two officers but by more than a dozen.
Sadiq Khan there saying he is disgusted by this report. Does it undermine your confidence in the Met and specifically in Cressida Dick, the Commissioner? Yes or no? Chris, to you.
Well, it does obviously undermine my confidence, because what we've heard in your report and in the IOPC report is shocking and completely unacceptable. What that team in Charing Cross Police Station did was completely wrong, and I'm appalled by it. And I do expect Cressida Dick to take responsibility for getting this sorted out. But I also expect Sadiq Khan to do the same, because he is ultimately accountable for the Metropolitan Police in London. He chairs MOPAC, the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime. He is in charge of that organisation. He is responsible on our behalf as Londoners for overseeing the Met. So I expect Sadiq Khan to take responsibility as well for getting this sorted out. There are clearly lessons to be learned here. The IOPC made recommendations. We should have a culture of zero tolerance for this kind of behaviour. We should have better reporting around these incidents so we know what's going on. And there's a message I would also just pass on to serving police officers, which I've discussed with the police minister. I think if any serving police officer witnesses this kind of behaviour, they should openly report it without fear of any kind of consequence, because we need officers who witness this to speak out and to do so without any kind of fear. And that is a critical part, I think, of helping to sort out this problem. But this report is appalling, and the lessons must be learned, action must be taken, no question.
Stella, should Cressida Dick go?
Yes, I'm sorry. I think that she should. I think that this is a real test for us, isn't it, in public life right now? At what point, what more has to happen under your watch as a leader, whether it is parties in Downing Street or this kind of horrific behaviour by the police that we've seen time and time again, to the extent that women in London, there's been a 50% drop in their confidence in policing. I'm sorry, I just cannot see how Cressida Dick can lead the Metropolitan Police out of this situation. This is not the first time that we've seen this kind of behaviour. And I fear, I'm somebody who's been working for a long time on a campaign to include misogyny in our hate crime legislation. And I hope, Chris, from the words that you said, you will support these efforts, because part of the reason we support that is the evidence in the police forces where they've been doing that. It has started to lead to a cultural change within policing and an understanding about misogyny and the violence and abuse that women face. The Met have been some of the strongest opponents under Cressida Dick's leadership of that policy proposal and that change. And when we hear this kind of behaviour from the police, when we see, to say, this is not the first instance, I think about the police took photos of Nicole and Bieber. I look at the numbers of serving officers now being charged with serious sexual offences. When we see that incident and those behaviours, I think we recognise that it is more than one bad apple. It is a culture within the police that has to be addressed, so that those serving police officers who are not part of it can have confidence they are going to have the leadership at a local, regional and indeed national level they deserve.
Chris, the report has found, as Stella said, this is more than just a few bad apples. Is it institutionally misogynistic, do you think?
No, I don't think I would go as far as to say that. I mean, there clearly is a problem, which this report highlighted, and it's clearly, it is more than one or two bad apples, to use the language of the report. So it is a problem that needs to be sorted out. But I mean, we should keep in mind, I think, that the vast majority of serving police officers, men and women of all colours, creeds, races and religions, are decent people working hard in sometimes difficult circumstances to keep us safe. That is the vast majority of our police, and we should be thankful and grateful for the service that they give us, protecting all of our communities across London.
But do you accept, Chris, that the trust and faith in the police is severely undermined?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, instances like this which, as I think the clip said, was, or the Mayor of London said, was 13 or 14 officers involved. It does undermine confidence, and that is why it is so important to take decisive action. The Commissioner needs to take decisive action. The lessons need to be learned. And the Mayor of London, but the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is ultimately responsible and accountable for policing in London, so he needs to act as well.
Stella, how does a culture change within a force that has 30,000 serving police officers? Whose job is it, and how does anybody even go about it?
Well, Cressida Dick has been very clear that she has operational independence from the Mayor. But look, I'd say to Chris, this is part of the problem. How many more incidents do there have to be before you recognise that there is an institutional challenge within the Metropolitan Police when it comes to misogyny and violence against women? Because I tell you, women in London are terrified. And the Sarah Everard case was a watershed moment, but it was not the first. It has not been the last. Many more women since her murder, since Bieber and Henry Nicholl's murders, have been subject to violence and abuse. So to simply dismiss that concern, I think, speaks to why there's been such a corrosion in confidence amongst women about the Metropolitan Police and why it needs that fresh leadership. And I just hope that Cressida Dick looks and recognises that those officers who need her support to change this cannot look to her to lead it, because what else has to happen before people recognise the problem that we're facing?
Stella,
how much worse does it have to get?
Thank you, Stella. Now, this week, as Boris Johnson criticised Russia's aggression towards Ukraine, many are calling the UK government hypocritical for having welcomed Russian wealth here and especially into London for so long. Now, the Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee has launched a new inquiry into the so-called dirty money. Helen Drew reports.
You don't have to look far from the centre of the capital to see why some people are calling it Londongrad. But the nickname goes far deeper than fancy cars and street signs.
If you ever returned to Russia, what would happen?
Well, if I were to return now, I would be arrested at the airport.
Vladimir Ashurkov is a former banker who has lived in London since 2014. He's an anti-corruption campaigner who is wanted in Russia and was granted political asylum in the UK. He says London is a popular place for rich Russians.
The most appealing, no doubt about it. It's close to Russia, everything works, people speak English, it's very welcoming to foreigners, it has a very nice tax regime of non-domicile residents. I think most Russian money that comes to Britain is legitimate. There are many bad apples among them, unfortunately, which brought the proceeds of corruption to Britain. And unfortunately, Britain, despite a lot of rhetoric about fighting dirty money, has not done much about it.
Billions of pounds of Russian money has flowed into London since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. In 2020, Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee said the UK had welcomed Russian money with open arms and asked very few questions, if any, about where that money came from. The committee said oligarchs were drawn here due to a light and limited touch to regulation. That approach, some say, impacts everyone in London.
We should be really proud of London and really ashamed of Londongrad, because this is where the worst people in the world come to launder their fortunes and their reputations. And we have an industry that gets rich helping them to do it. And we're all poorer and less safe as a result. The dirty money flooding into London affects everybody. It sends house prices skyrocketing because rich people will pay anything for a boat hole in London, and that means we can't afford it. It is awful for people who find they don't know who their neighbours are. And you have a leak or a nuisance in the flat next door, and it turns out it's owned in the British Virgin Islands. You can't find who the real owner is.
Now the Foreign Affairs Select Committee says it's time to examine the wealth once more.
We need to look at exactly what money is coming in, what it's doing here in the capital, what it's distorting, and what more action the government could take against specific individuals, because we have, in fact, the The previous Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron promised to have a register of foreign ownership of London properties, and it has not appeared 6 years later. This is a government that is not taking seriously, and it undermines the claim that the UK is leading action against Russia, because if this was serious, if the UK was a serious inhibitor to Vladimir Putin, we would be taking action on this issue.
The scale and impact of Russian money here is notoriously hard to track. The Foreign Affairs Select Committee will be collecting evidence over the next few weeks.
Well, Stella, why are successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, turning a blind eye to this?
Well, I think it's very clear that there are proposals that could be put forward, and indeed we have put them forward in Parliament, but this government has turned them down. And I think if you want to look at the political nature of this, I would be looking at the numbers of Russian oligarchs who are donating to the Conservative Party and ask myself why time and time again measures which have cross-party support, like a register of the properties. It's worth reflecting on the fact that in most boroughs, the numbers of properties have gone up. But in Kensington and Chelsea, actually the number of properties on the electoral register has gone down, because so many of these properties are held as shell companies for Russians and others to run money through, that they're not registering any voters in them. So it's a very visceral example of the impact this is having on our communities. There's poor regulation. There's agreement that we need to have this register. There's agreement that we need to do more about Companies House and the transparency of ownership of properties to stop people laundering money. And yet, time and time again, this government and Conservative MPs vote those proposals down. And yet they're also taking money in their as Conservative associations from these Russian oligarchs.
OK, so let's put those points to Chris then. Chris.
Well, on the question of the register, the government reaffirmed just a few months ago it does intend to legislate. I haven't been voting against it. The government said we intend to legislate to set up this register so that there is transparency where a property is owned by some offshore company.
But Chris, there was a 2020 report on Russian money in London. It's been sat on by the Prime Minister, hasn't it? Why?
Well, what did he say? He reaffirmed in November we are going to legislate to get that register done. In turn, we've introduced unexplained wealth orders, so people whose wealth is, as the name suggests, unexplained can be gone after. The Magnitsky Act was brought into force a couple of years ago, and since then 49 people have been, and organisations have been sanctioned, including 25 Russians and 20 Saudis who were caught up in the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, two generals from Myanmar and two companies from...
Chris, Neil Coyle said in that report then that this is undermining the UK's threat of sanctions to counter Russian aggression in Ukraine. Is that happening? Is that what your assessment is?
I don't think so, but I think there is more we can do. And I believe that the Foreign Secretary will very, very shortly, in the coming days, I believe, be making some announcements about how we can go further in our sanctions regime, so that if a situation like Ukraine arises, we can go after individuals who are of importance to the economic and strategic importance to the Kremlin, besides those people who are directly connected to any kind of outrage. When there was the last outrage, the invasion of Crimea in 2014, we went after 180 Russians there.
Let me just bring Stella in there for a final word. Stella.
You had a government minister resign over the last couple of days because he was so furious that this legislation hasn't come forward. Yes, absolutely, we need to go after the individuals. We also need to reform Companies House. I just want to pay tribute to Margaret Hodge, who's been a brilliant campaigner and has dragged this government into doing it, including things like the Magnitsky Act. It's not come from this government. They're too busy playing tennis with the more organised parties in Downing Street.
Apologies to you both. We are out of time. We will, of course, revisit this story, I'm sure. That is all we have time for this week. My thanks to my guests, to Stella and to Chris. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye, or should I say for our Russian viewers watching here in the capital, Dos Vidania.